Hi guys, it's Kelly here and I'm back with another video for Honeybee Stamps. Today we are going to be using Bloom with Grace. This is one of my illustrated sets with Honeybee. I showed you the forest floor. I ended up taking that in a different direction, so I didn't use it for this one. The 3D burlap embossing folder and then the fancy fall layering frames. Oh, and I also used the Sweet Stacks rectangles. I didn't show you because I didn't know how this was going to go. Sometimes, you just sit down to create and it takes on a life of its own. Which you may notice that this particular set of cards, we're making 3 of them today. Again, not my intention. That's just what happened. Have a very vintage feel, which isn't necessarily my vibe most of the time. Jokingly, I told Dawn today, Dawn Wolfslagel, I was like, I made some very Dawn cards because these are totally her vibe. So to start, I am working on Nina 80-pound solar white cardstock, and I'm going to stamp a background using the 3 sunflowers that are included in the Bloom with Grace set. I wanted to do them with some no-line coloring, so do as I say, not as I do. Make sure that your stamps are clean. So here you saw me clean them because I never clean my stamps. I'm really terrible about it. So I clean them first, and now I'm inking them up with the no line ink from Honeybee, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp them down. Now, if you're trying to create the look of pattern paper, you want to make sure that you're always stamping off the edge and that you're filling the middle. So I try to fill my middle first and then fill in the outside edges, but all of the stamping around the edges, I try very hard to make sure that it does hang over the edge. It gives the impression that the pattern continues on. And then also with the no line coloring ink, I always stamp them twice. In order to create this background, I did need some masks for the print that I was going for, but you could stamp it without any masking. You would just need to make sure that you're aware of where the lines are for like the leaves and things. For me, when I'm doing no line coloring, I'm already confused enough by the lines. I wasn't going to add to it by adding in like leaf lines. So I found it easier to just cut some masks. I'm using Eclipse masking paper. As long as I'm not die cutting, that is my preferred type of masking paper. And I'm just going to put these down so that I can stamp my leaves and that they will look like they are behind my flowers. So that's pretty much the whole purpose of the masking there. It's not for the background, like for me to color the background. It's just for me to be able to stamp my leaves. Now here is where I'm going to show you what happens if you don't clean your stamps. So the first time around, I was really good. I cleaned them for the flowers. I did not clean them for the leaves. And look how much darker they are. And that is because the ink, that no line coloring ink, kind of rejuvenates the ink that's still left sitting on your stamp and will make them darker. So this time I cleaned them, and you can see how much they stamp so much lighter. Thankfully, I was already going to be doing my leaves a darker green, so it's okay. You're not really going to be able to see that. And then here, this is just sped up so you guys could see, the rest of how it came together. In addition to this background, I also stamped some of the flowers and leaves as extras that I will be die cutting, and that's what you're going to see here. So before we get too far into the coloring, I do want to say that we're going to be talking about the class, about the Honeybee class, the dimensional mixed media class that I am doing with the Honeybee products. We are going to touch on that, and we're going to have a little bit of story time. But first, let me tell you what I need to tell you about the coloring, right? About the card. So when I'm doing no line coloring, one of the things that I really, really struggled with in the beginning was getting my image looked like a blob. And I was like, I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. Why can I not retain any of the detail from the stamp? And in doing it and practicing it and watching other people, what I learned is when you're doing no line coloring, you almost have to put in your like your shadows first, because you have to maintain that line. So if you go in with your lightest color, which is what I used to do, I would go in with my lightest color and just kind of like color all over everything. You blow out your lines. And then there's nothing that's just a blob, and you have to kind of guess where it needs to go. So here, like with the center of the sunflower, this one that's full front facing, I started with the darkest color on the outside edge of its center, and then, you know how sunflowers like typically have two sections of, what are they? They're like seeds and then the stamen. I'm not sure why there's two different sections, but I can tell you that there is when you look at them. Botanist, I am not. So anyway, I'm starting with the darkest edge, which for me is an E59. And for both of them, I'm starting with that dark edge and really getting in there. Now for this particular coloring, I am using stippling, which is just a series of small dots. And the reason that I am doing that is to give that color variation and the impression that we have a lot of little like seeds or a lot of little stamen in there in the center, which is how, you know, classically you see sunflowers when they grow in nature. So I'm showing you a front view and then also a side view. There are two flowers in here that have a side view. So that way you can, you know, watch to see how you would color either one of them. And really just, you know, kind of playing around with the dots, you see me, you know, kind of going back and forth just to make sure that I have enough shading that I'm happy with. And you can do the same thing. Just play around with it until you're happy. So now I am going to color this large front-facing sunflower. Now I colored all of them the same, but what you see me doing here is I'm going in, this is my darkest color. This is an E99. And what I'm doing is I'm looking for the petals that are sitting behind. And right away, I'm going in and adding in my shadows to maintain that line, that shape of the petal. So by looking for where I need it to be the darkest, you can see kind of like the shape of the petals start to come to life. And that is going to help us to make sure that we do not have one big blob of a sunflower, because we're already putting in those lines. And the lines are already there for you. I know it's hard to see on camera, but it's already there for you in that no line coloring ink. Just as we're going over it with the alcohol markers, that's going to start to disappear, which is what we want in order to get a no line coloring look. So once I've gone through the whole flower and I've laid down my lines where I need to keep the line separate, now I can go in and use that darkest color to start to add some shadows and to give shape to the petals that are sitting on top. Now you can see when I'm doing that, it almost looks like little V's, like little narrow V's as I'm coming up from the petal. That's because I need to keep the side of the petal, the edge of the petal, nice and light, because that contrast between the dark of the shadows and the light of the highlight is what is going to give us our shape. So now that's the hardest part. Because once we have those shadows down, now we know just going in with our darker midtone, which is the YR24, and then the lighter midtone, which is a Y21, we're just going over the colors that we just put down and just slightly extending it out. So the very far, far back petals that are really, really tucked behind maybe 2 or 3 layers of petals, those ones the lightest color will be that Y21. And then for the ones that sit on top, the lightest color is going to be a Y11. And that will further create that contrast between our layers to help it look really dimensional. This truly, like when they're done, especially the ones that are die cut, it really looks like you're creating your own ephemera, which I think is pretty cool. So we're going to get into the textures and stuff, but I have to do all of the coloring first. So now, while we color, let's talk about the class. So if you watch on my channel, then you already know this. You've already seen it. If you're watching on the Honeybee channel, then this might be news for you. But so I am doing back in, what was it? March? Yeah, back in March, I did a class with some Honeybee product that was for Crop on the Cape. And I taught that in person. I had a bunch of kits left over. And so I asked you guys about, if you were interested in receiving them. You said you were. So we did an option where we sold the class and we sold the class with the kit. The kit contains all of the pre-stamped and pre-die cut images from Lovely Layers, the Lovely Layers that we're using, from the Everything Beautiful set. That's the stamp image that we're using. The sentiments are stamped and die cut. And then everybody is getting the little autumn pearls, like a section of the autumn pearls to finish out your cards. That's what was in the kit. And so those did sell out. We had a very limited number of those. It was just what was left over. Those did sell out. However, the class is still available for purchase, and it will be a live class. Will be live on November 16th. And you can find all that information over on my website. Honeybee has very, very generously been, supporting me. They've given me a landing page which lists anything that they carry that we used for the class. They've listed it there on the landing page. So please make sure that you do compare the product list once you purchase the class to the landing page, because not everything is in there. It's just all of the things that they do carry. And so that's still, the registration for that is still open. I do want to say it is a class that, if you have any of the Lovely Layers, the technique will work for that. Or, you can use any stamped image. You don't necessarily have to use the ones that we are using in class, though obviously, it helps to be able to follow along, but it's a technique-based class. So it's not necessarily about the product. So I would encourage you to check that out if you would like to just spend a Saturday kind of crafting along, and that we could spend a little bit of time together. And of course it's live, so any questions that you have, I would be able to answer. If you are choosing to purchase the class, please, please, please make sure you have first created an account and you are logged in, because the membership gets assigned to your account once you purchase the class. And so a lot of people ran into a lot of problems because they weren't logged in. And so because this is the first time that I'm doing it, thank you guys so much for your grace and your patience. I had a lot of issues, which is a story time for another day. I had a lot of issues. But I think that we did kind of fix them, and get it kind of worked out. So anyway, now I've colored the whole leaf. Don't worry, I'm going to color more leaves. So here, basically, in order to keep the shape, I did the same thing. I went in with my darkest color, and here you're going to see it again. Basically, anywhere that I'm going to have that shadow, I'm going to go in right away with my darkest color. Now, this flower is laying on top of this leaf, so I know that whole edge is going to be darker. So right away, I'm going to go in and outline that edge. And then for the veins in the leaf that are already drawn in, I followed along those. And then on the outside edge, because sunflower leaves are notched, they're serrated. So I'm just pulling in a little bit of color at each point where it kind of dips in to help give it just a little bit more shape. Now, this leaf, because more of it is tucked behind than the other one that we just did, where you can see almost the full entirety of the leaf, is going to be a little bit darker. Have no fear, it's supposed to look that way. If this leaf was tucked completely underneath this flower, it wouldn't receive as much light. So the other thing that I did want to show you is for the flowers that have the side view, it does have, kind of the little leaves at the bottom that connect to the stem. And how I do that is right away, again, with the darkest color, I want to establish my stem. And then when I'm doing the leaves that will sit on top, I'm making sure that the leaf that's going to be right next to that stem, that is the lightest edge. And then it creates, again, that contrast, that separation between the leaves and the stem. So now, once I have it all colored, I am going to put it into the Burlap 3D embossing folder. This is one of my most favorite embossing folders. It gives such great texture. It almost makes it look like it's fabric. And then in order to just kind of highlight that texture a little bit more, I am going to go in with some pumice stone and one of the large honeybee blending brushes and just go right over top of that. These are the other ones that I colored. I colored them the same way as I did the background, but these ones we're going to die cut to be our focal points. So I'm just going to hold those in place with some low tack tape and then run them through. Now, my intention when I did this was to do like just one card. And I wasn't sure exactly how it was going to come together because you know how it is. Sometimes when you're creating, you're not necessarily sure what your finished product is going to look like. But I knew I wanted to use this. What is this, you might ask? This is a Fiskars, and I obviously don't know how to use it. As you can see, I'm playing around with it. This is a Fiskars paper crimper. Now, these are hard to find. I had to get mine on eBay. I blame Dawn again because she had one and it adds such great texture. It is like corrugated. Speaking of, if you can't find the Fiskars one, there are still some on eBay that are for sale. There's two different ways that you can do it. You can look into the Marvi Yakurta corrugator, the straight edge, which Honeybee does sell in their shop. I think it's like $15-16, and it does basically the same thing. Or you can do this, which is, I use my paper trimmer, but if you have a scoreboard, it would also work. You would just take a bone folder. This is the small bone folder from Honeybee. And then in just measured increments, which for me was like 1/8 of an inch, I just went in and did the lines, pressed down the lines to score it. And that will, in fact, create the same lines that corrugated look. And you could do them as close together or as far apart as you would prefer. This is the cheapest option. The easiest option is to get the paper crimper or the corrugator. But either way, no matter what your budget is, you can still get this look, which I appreciate because, I also was a crafter on a budget. So here, this is the it's ivory colored cardstock, and I am stamping my sentiments in brown ink. This is a cooler brown. This is Cup of Joe from Hero Arts, but again, use whatever you like. And I am going to stamp this down so that I can die cut it out. Since I have a very vintage vibe going on, I didn't want to use stark white. I thought that the ivory would be a bit softer and kind of play into that vintage vibe that these cards were definitely giving. I mean, that background is giving vintage. There's nothing that I could do about it. The cards took me where they wanted me to go. I mean, sometimes it just is that way. But I do feel like they're very fall. You guys will have to let me know if this is your vibe or not. So then here I'm trying to figure out my layers and how I'm going to put my things together. This looks so much like fabric to me with that little burlap impression, like that 3D embossing on it. I love it so much. So here I'm using several of the layers of the Sweet Stacks for some die cutting. So I'm going to die cut some layers out of the corrugated paper that we did, that craft color. I'm also going to do some out of the ivory, and then the green that you see there, that is pesto cardstock from Hero Arts. And I decided that I wanted to use, I was like so mad because I colored that whole middle and then I was going to cover it up, and I was like, nah, you're not either, because you're cheap and you're going to make use of it. So what I did was I measured everything out how I wanted my first card to go. And then I went with a slightly smaller rectangular stack and I cut the middle right out of it to make a third card. So here is another texture that we can use, which is a die or a cover plate that has embossed texture. This one, I use it a lot. This is the Fancy Fall layering frames. And this one is the whole edge, and it gives kind of like a leather bound kind of feel to it. And so I'm going to do that one, and it will emboss the whole edge. It is a perfect A2 size card. And then I can layer this middle up to make it like more hefty, layer it up with some other papers to help it become a focal point with just a really simple little sentiment. And again, I love the way that one came out. So for the other part of like the vintage vibe that you can really like bolster it up with is adding some brown or some grayish brown type of ink blending to the edges. So that's what I'm doing here. What am I using? It's either brushed corduroy or it's probably brushed corduroy. And then so I'm just adding a little bit of shading to the edges of that. It's going to pick up more on the highlighted areas, a little less on the ones that are in the valley. And then I'm also going to add it around the embossed, like the impression that was left by our little die cut. And for this one, I actually did do both of them. So I did the brushed corduroy, and then it might be gathered twigs or it might be vintage photo. Either one would be totally fine. But that way it just really kind of helps that embossed part kind of shine because our focal point is a little bit smaller. It was like the background was like kind of looming. It was oversized for what we needed. So adding that darker ink blending around the edges helps kind of bring everything together. Then here, this is that green cardstock, but I wanted it to be a little bit darker, so I'm adding some peeled paint, and then we're going to start building everything together. Again, I am cheap. Here's that you can see. I've cut it out of the middle. Nobody will know. They're not going to know. Bear with me. And then also I am adhering it to the ivory colored cardstock that I cut my sentiments out of, because I thought that I was going to cut the squares like with the sentiments in the background, and that didn't end up happening. So this is just going to be my placeholder for all of my items until I can get it onto a card base. But nobody will know. I promise you. I promise you. By the time we're done, nobody will know. So, anywho, I was teasing Dawn. So like Dawn is always like super amazing with her, her vintageness. And then every once in a while, like we all kind of venture out into our things. So her set for Honeybee was the, what was it called? Storybook Fall. And so she did some like really cute little like vignette kind of scenes, which is maybe a little bit more my style. And then like here, I'm doing a little bit more her style. So don't be afraid to kind of like branch out and see, the different techniques and things that you can try. And none of them are going to be 100%. None of them are going to be like, oh, I love the way that this came out. But that's part of the process in learning your style and what you really, really love. And so for me, even though vintage is not necessarily my go-to style, because I do love a bold black outline, I do love a bright color, a rainbow, like that is for me, I can still appreciate cards like these ones and see how beautiful they are without them being necessarily my cup of tea 100% of the time. So here, like I said, nobody even sees that hole. Nobody sees it. But so for this one, I am going to pretty much attach everything to that one piece, that ivory rectangle, and then I'm going to pop it up from there. Each one of these cards has an element that is popped up. For this one, it's this whole rectangle with the floral and the leaves that's popped up over that wave. It's the corrugated one. I don't even know what you call that. Crimped. It's crimped. Do you remember when crimping our hair was a thing? Like, well, if you're not an 80s kid, but I was, and I definitely crimped my hair. I think it's coming back though, or it was coming back. Like you could swap out the plates on your hair straightener for like a crimped one. I don't know why anybody would want to do that, but who am I? I mean, I have naturally curly hair, so I think maybe I don't get on that same thing like everybody else does. So something else that you can do to add like a little bit of a vintage feel is to do some tone on tone kind of spatters. This is going to help add interest to this larger piece. that is our background. You could also add some distressing. You could use a paper sander to kind of rough up the edges. You could do some tone-on-tone stamping in the background, like a text stamp would be a very vintage vibe. My vintage is still a little bit more clean. That's just because that's how I prefer my cards. So here I'm going to go ahead and put that layered up focal point down, and then I will add my sentiment. This one is the title, the name of the set, which is Bloom with Grace. And so I'm going to go ahead and put that down, and then we will eventually accent all of these with some rhinestones. So here I'm adding a little bit of shimmer to my florals because even vintage things should have glitter. That's not true. That's not really a vintage vibe, but I don't care because it's my card. I'm going to do what I want. And then I use some of the brown rhinestones. This is from, or like bronze. They're more bronze. The Fall is in the Air gem stickers. And I use the same for all of them. The one on the right, the element that's popped up is the flowers, by the way. So that one on the right, like it just kind of came together with all my leftover pieces. And then here, this is the one, like you'll see when I flip it over here in a minute, like, that no one will see it once it's on a card base. But these are how all three of the cards came together. Whether you're more of like a clean vintage, this one's very clean, very, straight lines. This one's more floral focused, and the other one is definitely more layered. But whatever your vibe is, you should be able to use some of these tips to create some vintage cards for yourself. So thank you guys so much for joining me. I always appreciate your time. I hope you will check out that honeybee class, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Bye.